erased from scripture, sealed behind a single verse, never meant to be found. Imagine this. A cracked stone tablet buried beneath centuries of slang. Its symbols still breathing, carved by hands that should not have existed. You are about to hear what Western churches buried, what Rome quietly removed, and what the Ethiopian Orthodox scribes guarded for millennia. In languages most scholars refuse to read, you did not arrive here by accident. What if the land of Nod was never just a place of exile, but a doorway, a fracture in creation where the laws of God no longer held authority, where fallen beings waited in the dark between worlds, and where the first forbidden civilization was built from knowledge, stolen from heaven itself? The dust is still trembling. The silence here has always been watching, and the real story, the one your church never taught you, begins exactly where the Bible stops speaking, so stay with me. There is a room in the archives of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church where certain manuscripts are kept behind doors that have not opened for centuries. The air inside, scholars say, smells of something older than parchment, a mineral stillness like stone that has never known sunlight. The texts stored there are written in Ge'ez, a liturgical language so ancient it predates most of the alphabets the modern world considers old. And among those texts, pressed flat beneath centuries of careful silence, lie accounts of a place that the Western Bible dismisses in a single sentence, a land called Nod east of Eden, where Cain walked after the blood of his brother had already dried into the soil. Most readers pass that verse without pausing. Genesis 4-16 offers nothing dramatic, nothing that invites investigation. A man leaves a direction, is given a name, is recorded, and then the text moves on as if the story had already said everything worth saying. But traveller, if you have spent any time inside late-night archives with ink-stained fingers and the particular exhaustion of someone who has been reading for too long, you will know that the silences in a document speak as loudly as its words. A text that says very little about something very significant is not being brief, it is being careful. And the careful silences around Nod stretch across 2,000 years of Western theological tradition like a shadow that refuses to move. The Ethiopian Church did not inherit that silence. While Rome was consolidating its canon in the 4th and 5th centuries, deciding with the authority of councils and emperors which books belonged inside the sacred boundary and which would be left outside in the cold, the Ethiopian's tradition was already ancient. Already shaped by texts that European Christianity would not see again for a millennium. The Ethiopian Bible contains 81 books, 81, where the Protestant tradition preserved 66 and the Catholic tradition 73, the Ethiopian scribes kept the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Adam and Eve, texts considered not supplementary, not secondary, not interesting curiosities, but fully canonical, read aloud in worship, copied by hand across generations, passed from elder to child the way that only essential things are passed. When European scholars first encountered these manuscripts in the 18th century, carried back from Ethiopia by travellers who understood something significant had been found, the response was a complicated mixture of fascination and institutional discomfort. Here was a Book of Enoch quoted directly in the New Testament by Jude, a text the apostles clearly knew, clearly valued, clearly treated as prophetic, and yet it had been absent from Western Christianity for over 1,000 years. It had not been lost through carelessness. Libraries do not lose their most important documents by accident. They lose them through decisions, through the slow accumulation of choices about what to copy and what to let decay, what to teach and what to let be forgotten, what to protect and what to allow to quietly disappear. The Ethiopian scholars, those patient men in candlelit rooms who had been maintaining these manuscripts while Europe forgot them existed, understood something that the councils did not, that to remove a text from circulation is not to remove the reality it describes. The land of Nod did not cease to exist because Rome stopped discussing it. The beings described in its ancient accounts did not become less real because their names were scratched from the margins of sanctioned scripture. History, as any archivist will tell you in the quiet of a closing library, is not what happened. History is what was allowed to survive. What the Ethiopian texts reveal about Nod is not what Sunday school prepared anyone to hear. The name itself carries a meaning that most translations smooth over without comment from the Hebrew root, meaning to wander, to shake, to move without peace. But Ethiopian interpretations reach deeper than etymology. They describe Nod not merely as a geographical location, not simply as a barren territory east of a garden, but as a specific kind of place, a zone where divine presence did not reach. A territory outside the protective boundary of God's law, a threshold, the texts say, where the membrane between the physical world and other dimensions grew thin enough to pass through, where beings that belonged to neither realm fully could move between them with ease, where the rules that governed the rest of creation became in some essential way negotiable. Imagine walking into a space where you can feel, rather than simply believe that something is different. Not wrong exactly, not at first, just different. The air sitting a fraction heavier than it should. The silence pressing along the stone in a way that suggests it is not empty, but full of something that has been waiting long enough to have learned patience. That is how the oldest accounts describe the first moments inside Nod's borders. Not terror. Not the obvious geometry of a haunted place. Something subtler and more unnerving, the sensation of having stepped out of one story and into another older one, whose rules have not yet been explained to you. Cain arrived in that place carrying a mark that had already changed him. He arrived as the first murderer, yes, but also as the first exile, the first human to exist entirely outside the protections that Eden, even in its diminished post-fall form, still offered. And the texts that Rome left behind in the dark that Ethiopia kept burning in the lamplight record what he found there, what found him, what began in that strange land east of everything familiar, the long and catastrophic experiment that would eventually require the entire world to be washed clean before anything could begin again. But that reckoning was still generations away, the story was just beginning, and the first lesson had not yet been taught. Rest now, traveller. The archive is open. The dust on these pages is old, but the words beneath it are not finished speaking. There is something that scholars of ancient manuscripts learn early, usually in the kind of dimly lit reading room where the radiators knock against the silence and the hours pass without announcement. They learn that the most important information in any document is rarely found in its declarations. It's found in its corrections in the words scratched out by a later hand in the margins, crowded with anxious annotations in the pages that have been carefully cut away and left as nothing but ragged edges along a binding that once held something the institution decided could not remain. The mark of Cain is one of those places, a passage that Western theology has smoothed into something manageable, something instructive, something that fits neatly inside a lesson about divine mercy toward even the worst of sinners. But the Ethiopian book of Adam and Eve does not smooth it, it opens it, and what lies underneath is not mercy alone, it is transformation of a kind that changes what Cain is at the level of perception itself. The traditional account offers a protective sign, something visible, something that warns potential avengers away, something that functions essentially as a legal marker in a world with very few laws. But the Ethiopian text describes a physical event at the moment the mark was given, a burning sensation that moved from Cain's forehead through his entire body, followed by a blurring of vision and then a clearing, except that what cleared was not the same world he had been looking at before. The air appeared different. It moved differently. It held within it shapes and presences and subtle disturbances that had always been there but had been invisible to human eyes until this moment. Cain heard frequencies his ears had never registered. He felt the weight of attention from directions that had no names. Something had opened in him, not in the way the forbidden fruit had opened, his parents' eyes in Eden. Not that sudden collapse of innocence into shame, but something more architectural, more deliberate, as if a wall had been removed and replaced with a window, looking into a room that had always existed just beyond the edge of ordinary sight. The texts are careful to distinguish between what Cain gained and what it cost him. He gained perception, genuine, verifiable access to dimensions of reality that remained closed to his contemporaries. But the opening was not selective. It did not give him light without shadow. It gave him everything that lived in that expanded frequency, and not all of it was benevolent, and not all of it was waiting for his benefit. An old archivist in Addis Ababa, a man who had spent 40 years cataloguing Ethiopian ecclesiastical manuscripts, once described this passage to a visiting scholar as the moment Cain became a receiver with no off switch. The signal was always on. The voices were always audible. The presences were always present. And in a land like Nod, where the membrane between realms was already thin, where the normal insulation of divine protection had been stripped away by geography and exile, that kind of openness was not a gift. It was an exposure. What Cain encountered in Nod, the texts say, came to him first in dreams, which is how the oldest accounts describe first contact with beings who are not yet certain of a welcome. The darkness in those early visions is described with a specificity that feels less like poetry and more like testimony. A darkness with texture, with weight, with the quality of something alive and attentive. Lights moved through it in patterns that did not match stars or fire. They circled, they studied, they waited. And when they spoke, they did not use the ordinary channels, sound travelling through air into ear, but something more direct, more interior voices arriving already inside the mind, with no memory of a journey. They knew his name, they knew his condition, they knew with a precision that required no explanation exactly how desperate he was, and exactly how useful that desperation could be made. The beings, the text named the Sons of Twilight, were not demons in the popular sense. Not the horned figures of later medieval imagination, not creatures whose corruption was written across their appearance in ways that would have prompted instant flight. They were beautiful in the specific way that the Book of Enoch describes the Watchers, too symmetrical, too luminous, their proportions carrying a slight wrongness that the eye registered, but the mind struggled to articulate. They did not quite touch the ground when they moved. Their garments held colours that seemed to generate their own light, shifting in ways that created a mild perceptual vertigo. And their eyes, the texts returned to the eyes, repeatedly contained something that made looking directly into them feel like standing at the edge of a very great height. Not threatening exactly, but vertiginous. The kind of depth that makes the body remember how small it is. They made Cain an offer. And traveller, when beings of that nature make an offer to someone who has nothing left to lose, the offer is rarely refused. They would teach him everything, the language of stone and metal, the geometry that connected earth to heaven, the names that held power over forces older than human civilization. In exchange, they asked three things: obedience, transmission, and preparation. He would learn, he would pass the learning on, and he would make the path easier for more of their kind to follow. It was not a contract written in ink. It was written in blood, in desperation, in the particular silence of a man who has already lost everything and finds that in the losing, something has been opened in him that cannot be closed again. The instruction began the following night, and what was built from that first lesson would eventually require a flood to dismantle. The record does not end there. Somewhere beneath the sediment of official history, the curriculum continues. There is a question that sits at the centre of the Genesis account like a stone that no one has been willing to turn over. It is not a complicated question. It does not require advanced theological training or access to restricted archives. It requires only the willingness to read what is actually written and then refuse to look away from what the text implies. The question is this: Cain was the second generation of human beings ever to exist. He had no cities to study, no architectural traditions to inherit, no accumulated engineering knowledge passed down through centuries of trial and error. His father had lived in a garden. His mother had never built anything more complex than a shelter from available branches. There were no predecessors, no blueprints, no guild of craftsmen with accumulated expertise. And yet within a few generations of his arrival in Nod, Cain built a city, not a settlement, not a collection of mud huts organised around a central fire. A city, a structure complex enough to require population management, resource allocation, architectural planning, and the kind of specialised knowledge that in every other civilization on record took thousands of years to develop. The traditional account offers no explanation for where this knowledge came from. The Ethiopian texts do. The city the Genesis account names Enoch after Cain's firstborn son is described in the Book of Jubilees, with a detail that the canonical text conspicuously omits. Its streets were not arranged according to practical convenience, or the path of least resistance through the available terrain. They were arranged according to celestial alignments oriented to stellar movements and planetary cycles, with a precision that archaeoastronomers would recognize in structures built thousands of years later in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in the stone circles of northern Europe. The layout followed mathematical ratios that have since been recovered in the sacred geometry of cultures that claim no connection to each other and no common ancestor. The central structure was not a granary or a palace. It was a tower. 7 tiered the texts say each tier, corresponding to one of the lower heavens, built not as a monument to human pride alone, but as a functional instrument designed according to explicit instructions from beings who understood the mechanics of dimensional crossing, the way a carpenter understands the grain of wood. What makes this anomaly so difficult for institutional scholarship to accommodate is not its strangeness in isolation. Ancient anomalies are everywhere, stones too large to be moved by known methods, alignments too precise to be accidental knowledge appearing in cultures too early to have developed it through conventional progression. What makes the Nod account particularly resistant to dismissal is its explanatory coherence. Every element that puzzles the standard narrative. Where did Cain's population come from? How did his descendants develop advanced technologies within living memory? Of Eden, why does his genealogy read like a list of civilization founding achievements rather than a family record? Every one of these puzzles resolves cleanly when the Ethiopian material is allowed to speak. The anomalies are not gaps in the story. They are evidence of an explanation that was removed. The descendants of Cain listed in Genesis move through their achievements with a brevity that reads in retrospect like deliberate compression. Jabal founded nomadic animal husbandry, a complete restructuring of humanity's relationship to the natural world, requiring the knowledge of breeding, disease, behavior, modification, and portable architecture. Jubal founded music, but not the simple rhythmic expression of a people beating stones together around a fire. Music, the Ethiopian Book of Jubilees, specifies design to alter consciousness to lower the threshold between ordinary human perception and the frequencies at which spiritual entities moved most freely. Tubal-Cain founded metallurgy, the extraction and shaping of metals from stone requiring knowledge of temperatures, alloying, and chemical processes that should have taken civilizations millennia to accumulate. The Book of Enoch names the specific watcher who taught each discipline. Azazel taught metalwork and the craft of weapons. Gadriel taught warfare. Penemuel taught writing and the hidden uses of language as a force rather than merely a tool of communication. These were not humans stumbling toward discovery through generations of patient experimentation. They were students in a curriculum that had been designed before their grandparents were born. The buildings constructed in Enoch, according to the Ethiopian sources, were not shelterers. They were machines assembled from materials selected for metaphysical properties as much as structural integrity arranged in geometric relationships that created resonances between the physical structure and the non-physical dimensions the watchers inhabited. Visitors to the city, the texts reported that the air inside the walls felt different, that distances seemed to shift depending on intention, that certain buildings induced specific altered states in those who entered them, a calm that bypassed rational thought, a receptivity that opened the mind to impressions it would ordinarily filter away. The architecture was a technology of consciousness designed not to house a population but to transform it. And the knowledge that produced it did not originate in human ingenuity. It arrived complete from teachers who'd been waiting in a land where the rules of creation had already begun to bend. Yet the record does not end there. Beneath every anomaly, another layer waits to be found. There is a particular kind of shunsenon that archivists learn to recognize, not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a room from which something has been deliberately removed. It has a different quality than ordinary absence. It has edges. It has the slight but unmistakable pressure of a shape that once occupied a space and left behind the outline of itself in the way that a painting removed from a wall leaves a cleaner patch of plaster where the dust could not settle. The silence around Cain's descendants in the Western canonical tradition has exactly that quality. The genealogy in Genesis 4 is presented with a briskness that feels to anyone who has spent time with ancient texts less like brevity and more like erasure in progress. Names listed, achievements noted in the fewest possible words, and then the narrative pivots sharply towards Seth's line, as if relieved to be moving away from something it did not want to examine too closely. The Ethiopian texts fill that silence, and what fills it is not comfortable. The descendants of Cain, according to the sources that Rome left to decay and Ethiopia preserved, in careful Gehi's script, were not simply wicked humans who rejected God and suffered the consequences. They were something more specific, more structurally significant, and more difficult to accommodate within a theological system that preferred clean moral categories. They were hybrids, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but in a sense the Ethiopian texts treat as biological and spiritual simultaneously. The watchers who taught Cain in those early nights in Nod had not remained at a careful instructional distance. They had moved closer. They had formed unions with the daughters of Cain's line across generations, producing offspring who carried within their genetics a combination that had no precedent in creation and no sanctioned place within its order. The silence in the Western account around the question of where Cain's growing population came from is not an oversight. It is a door that the canonical editors chose not to open because what waited on the other side of it complicated everything. The Book of Enoch describes the first hybrid children born in Nod with a clinical horror that feels more like testimony than mythology. Their mothers struggled to carry pregnancies that grew beyond natural parameters. Their births were difficult in ways that suggested the bodies of ordinary women were not designed to accommodate what was developing inside them. The children who survived came into the world already wrong in subtle ways, growing faster than human children, learning with an ease that bypassed the normal stages of development, as if they were remembering rather than discovering, demonstrating capabilities that their parents could not explain, and their teachers had not directly taught. They were beautiful, many of the texts note, in the way that the watchers themselves were beautiful, with that same slightly excessive quality, that same luminous wrongness that registered somewhere below the threshold of conscious recognition. People were drawn to them instinctively, the way that people are drawn to fire understanding somewhere in the body, rather than the mind that the attraction itself may be a form of danger. What the institutional church found most difficult about this material, and what the councils of the 4th and 5th centuries worked hardest to suppress, was not the supernatural content itself. Early Christianity was thoroughly supernatural in its framework, comfortable with angels and miracles and the direct intervention of divine power in human affairs. What was difficult was the implication that evil operated not only through human moral failure but through physical inheritance, that corruption could be transmitted genetically, could accumulate across generations, could produce a population that was not simply choosing badly but was constituted differently at a level that choice alone could not address. This idea complicated the church's developing soteriology in ways that institutional theology preferred to avoid. If corruption was genetic as well as moral, then salvation required something more than repentance. It required ultimately the kind of intervention that the flood itself represented, not punishment but surgery, not anger, but the elimination of a contamination that had spread too far to be treated through ordinary means. The silence that settled over these texts in the Western tradition was therefore not accidental, and not simply the result of competing manuscripts and uncertain provenance. It was the silence of a decision made in rooms where powerful men weighed the costs of full disclosure against the benefits of a simplified narrative and chose simplification. They chose a story in which evil was human and redemption was personal, and the cosmic scale of the conflict between ordered creation and deliberate corruption could be safely reduced to a lesson about individual moral responsibility. They chose, in other words, to remove from the curriculum the very information that would have allowed believers to recognize what the Watchers had started in Nod, when it appeared again as it always appeared again in new forms, wearing new names, carrying the same ancient philosophy and the architecture of new institutions and the language of new promises. The silence they created was not neutral. It was protective cover for a pattern that never stopped repeating. And in the Ethiopian archives, behind doors that have not opened for centuries, the record of that pattern was kept. Waiting with the patience of something that has already survived everything history has thrown against it for someone willing to read it in the dark. Some truths survive only in whispers, and some whispers have been waiting a very long time to be heard. There is a phenomenon that historians of suppressed knowledge encounter repeatedly so consistently that it has ceased to surprise and begun instead to instruct. It is the phenomenon of the deliberate epoch, the era that powerful institutions agree without formal announcement to treat as if it did not fully exist. Not denied outright, because outright denial invites investigation. Simply rendered peripheral, exotic, too strange to be taken seriously, too distant to be relevant, too contaminated by mythology to be approached with the same rigorous tools that respectable scholarship applies to approved history. The pre-flood world described in the Ethiopian texts occupies exactly this status in Western academic and theological discourse. It is acknowledged in the broadest outlines. Yes, there were early humans. Yes, there was a flood narrative. Yes, certain ancient texts describe beings and events that do not fit comfortably into conventional frameworks. And then it is set aside, filed under mythology, classified as pre-scientific cosmology, and left to gather dust in the margins where institutional scholarship places everything it has decided not to examine. But the dust on those margins is not the dust of irrelevance. It is the dust of something deliberately undisturbed. The forgotten epoch that the Ethiopian texts describe is not a simple golden age of primitive innocence before civilization. It is something far more architecturally complex and far more spiritually significant than that comfortable narrative allows. It is an era in which two completely different visions of what humanity could become were being developed simultaneously in two completely different locations by two completely different kinds of teacher. In the valleys and lowlands surrounding Nodkane's descendants and their watcher instructors were building the first version of a civilization founded on the principle that knowledge is power, that power justifies itself, and that the boundaries God established for creation were restrictions to be overcome rather than protections to be honoured. In the high places on the mountain that the Book of Jubilees calls the Holy Mountain, the descendants of Seth were maintaining something quieter and less spectacular, but no less significant, a community organised around the radical idea that relationship with the Creator was sufficient, that faithfulness within given limits was not weakness, but wisdom, and that the knowledge offered by fallen beings in exchange for loyalty was a transaction with terms that no honest accounting would accept. The contrast between these two communities is drawn in the Ethiopian texts with a precision that feels archaeological, as if the writers had access to records of both traditions and were carefully noting what each preserved and what each lost. Seth's line had no cities, no metallurgy, no architecture of consciousness, no music designed to dissolve the boundaries between human perception and the frequencies at which spiritual entities operated. They had something that the inhabitants of Nod had surrendered, without fully understanding what they were surrendering, a directness of access to divine presence that did not require intermediaries, did not require rituals of summoning, did not require the kind of obedience that the Sons of Twilight demanded from their students. They called upon the name of God, the text says simply, without apparatus, without the elaborate ceremonial technology that was developing in the valley cities. And in that simplicity they maintained something that the hybrid civilization accumulating forbidden knowledge in the lowlands was systematically dismantling in its population the capacity to receive truth without it being filtered first through a fallen intelligence that had its own reasons for shaping what was transmitted. The name that stands above all others in Seth's genealogy is Enoch the seventh from Adam, described with a phrase used nowhere else in the surly Genesis narrative. He walked with God. 3 words that the Ethiopian texts expand into entire chapters of cosmological revelation, describing a man who received direct access to the structure of creation itself, who was shown the paths of the Watchers and the nature of their rebellion, who witnessed in vision the catastrophe that was coming and understood its necessity, and who was taken into the heavenly realms without experiencing death, translated bodily, the texts say, as a demonstration that transcendence was available through faithfulness, and that the counterfeit version being sold in Nod was not merely inadequate, but was specifically designed to foreclose the genuine article. The 2 Enochs, Cain's son, who had a city built in his honour, and a curriculum of forbidden knowledge named for his lineage, and Seth's descendant, who built nothing on earth but walked so closely with the divine that the earth eventually could not hold him, represent the 2 possible endpoints of the choice that humanity faced in that forgotten epoch. One path led to a city that would need to be drowned. The other led to a departure so complete that even death could not interrupt it. The epoch has been forgotten because those who controlled the transmission of memory decided that its full record was inconvenient. The records themselves, however, were not destroyed. They were moved, carried south, preserved in highland monasteries, copied by hands that understood they were maintaining something essential against the day when the institutions that had tried to bury it would no longer have the authority to keep it down. That day traveller has been arriving slowly for several centuries now, and the forgotten epoch is beginning with the patience of something that has always known it would outlast its suppression to remember itself. But that was only the beginning. The deeper record had not yet been opened. There is a moment in every archive, in every collection of records old enough to have survived institutional decisions about what should and should not persist where the chronology breaks. Not gradually, not through the slow accumulation of gaps that any honest historian expects, but suddenly a clean discontinuity like a chapter that ends mid-sentence and resumes 3 pages later in a different handwriting with different ink, as if the original scribe had been replaced by someone who was present for the events but had been told in no uncertain terms which parts of them were permitted to be remembered. The flood narrative in the Western canonical tradition has exactly that quality. A world of enormous complexity and spiritual significance, hybrid civilizations, architectural machines for dimensional crossing, 2 bloodlines representing 2 completely different futures for humanity, and then water, and then Noah, and then a rainbow. And then the story continues as if the world that preceded the water had been so thoroughly erased that nothing from it could possibly have survived into what came after. The Ethiopian texts know better. And they say so with the quiet certainty of scholars who have been holding the missing pages for a very long time. The flood in the tradition that Rome preferred to transmit is primarily a moral story. Humanity became wicked. God became grieved. A righteous man was chosen, a vessel was constructed, a catastrophe was survived, a covenant was established. The lesson is clear, the arc is satisfying, and the supernatural elements, the engineering specifications delivered by divine instruction, the gathering of animal pairs, the precise chronology of rising and receding waters are treated as either literal miracle or inspired metaphor depending on the theological tradition of the reader. But the Ethiopian sources understand the flood not primarily as punishment and not primarily as moral instruction. They understand it as intervention, specifically as the kind of targeted intervention that a creator performs when a creation has been altered at a level so fundamental that ordinary correction cannot reach it. Not anger, the texts insist with a precision that feels almost clinical. Necessity. The same necessity that drives a physician to remove tissue that has become incompatible with the survival of the organism it once belonged to. What required that level of response was not simply the accumulation of human wickedness, which had been present in various forms since Eden and had never previously prompted total annihilation. What required it was the specific nature of the corruption that Nod had seeded into the world, a corruption that operated not only through moral choice, but through physical inheritance, through the hybrid genetics that the Watchers had been carefully developing across generations, through the altered consciousness that Nod's architectural technology had produced, in populations who had never chosen to be transformed, but had been transformed nonetheless by the environments they inhabited and the bloodlines they carried. By the time the flood came, the texts say there was no longer a meaningful distinction between the descendants of Seth and the descendants of Cain. The mountain communities had emptied. The separation that had preserved a remnant of uncorrupted humanity had collapsed under the accumulated weight of curiosity, temptation, and the particular desperation of young men who looked down from a hard and simple life into valleys filled with light and music and the kind of knowledge that promised to make them more than what they were. Noah is described in Genesis as perfect in his generations, a phrase that Western theology reads primarily as moral commendation, and that the Ethiopian tradition understands as also, and perhaps primarily genetic. He was the last man whose bloodline had not been mixed with the hybrid inheritance spreading from Nod. Not the most righteous man alive in a world of moral corruption, though he was that too, but the last genetically unaltered human being. The final thread connecting the post-flood world to the humanity that God had originally designed. The Ark was not merely a survival vessel. It was a genetic preservation chamber carrying forward the one line through which the promised restoration could eventually come, the one bloodline that had not been rewritten by beings who had no authorization to rewrite it. But here is what the reset failed to fully accomplish, and what the Ethiopian texts record with an honesty that the simplified Western narrative carefully avoids. The flood did not eliminate everything. The Bible itself acknowledges in passages that most readers pass without pausing that Nephilim appeared after the flood as well as before it. The hybrid genetics survived through what mechanism the texts offer only partial answers, but survived they did emerging in post-flood populations as the giant clans that the Israelites would later encounter in Canaan. The Anakim, the Rephaim, Og of Bashan, Goliath of Gath. These were not isolated mutations or regional legends. They were remnants of a program that the flood had interrupted but not concluded, and the knowledge the Watchers had taught the architectural and philosophical and occult curriculum first delivered to Cain in Nod also survived. Encoded in oral traditions preserved in artifacts hidden, before the waters rose carried in the memory of bloodlines that understood what they were maintaining and why it needed to be kept. The reset had been real, but it had been incomplete. And in that incompleteness, the pattern that began in Nod continued, wearing new names, building new cities, teaching new students in the same ancient curriculum. History was rewritten, but not erased. Somewhere beneath the ruins, something ancient still waits. There is a principle that experienced archivists apply when they encounter a pattern recurring across unconnected civilizations, cultures that had no trade routes between them, no shared language, no documented contact, and yet produced the same symbols, the same architectural ratios, the same cosmological frameworks, the same hierarchical structures of initiation and forbidden knowledge. The principle is simple, and its implications are uncomfortable when a pattern recurs with that degree of precision across that degree of separation. The explanation is not coincidence, and it is not the universal tendency of human minds to arrive independently at similar conclusions. The explanation and its transmission. Something was past. Something survived the distances and the centuries and the deliberate efforts of institutions to interrupt its movement. And what was past, the Ethiopian texts insist with a quiet persistence that feels less like theology and more like archaeological observation, was the curriculum that the Sons of Twilight first delivered to Cain in the land east of Eden, the complete body of forbidden knowledge that the Watchers had carried down from their observation posts at the threshold between heaven and earth. The echo of Nod in post-flood civilization is not subtle once you know what pattern to listen for. It appears in the megalithic construction traditions of cultures separated by oceans and millennia, all of them moving stones of impossible weight with no credible explanation for the technology employed, all of them aligning their structures to stellar and planetary cycles, with a precision that required astronomical knowledge accumulated over centuries, all of them incorporating the same geometric ratios into their sacred architecture, the same proportions that the Ethiopian texts describe the Watchers teaching to Cain's architects in the first city ever built by human hands. Baalbek in Lebanon preserves foundation stones weighing hundreds of tons that modern engineers acknowledge they cannot replicate with contemporary equipment. The pyramids of Giza encode mathematical constants that were not supposed to be discoverable by the civilization that supposedly built them. The temples of Angkor Wat in Cambodia are aligned to the same stellar configurations as sites in Egypt and Mesopotamia with which they had, according to conventional chronology, no connection. These are not coincidences accumulating beyond the threshold of statistical credibility. They are echoes, reverberations of a source event that conventional scholarship has decided to classify as myth precisely because the source event, if taken seriously, requires acknowledging that something was teaching human civilization from outside it. The philosophical echo is perhaps more disturbing than the architectural one because philosophy leaves fewer physical traces, and is therefore more easily dismissed as the natural convergence of human intellectual development rather than the transmission of a specific body of thought. But the philosophy that echoes most persistently across the forbidden traditions of human history is too specific, too structurally coherent, too identical in its key commitments to be the product of independent invention. It is the philosophy first articulated, the Ethiopian texts tell us, by the Sons of Twilight in their early conversations with Cain, the philosophy that humanity is unfinished, that the Creator's design for human beings is a limitation rather than a gift, that the path to genuine fulfillment runs through transgression of divine boundaries rather than within them, and that knowledge obtained from non-human sources at the cost of conventional allegiance to the Creator is the highest form of human achievement. This philosophy appears in the mystery traditions of ancient Egypt, in the Gnostic systems that the early Church worked so hard to eliminate in the Hermetic philosophy of Renaissance Europe, in the initiatory structures of the secret societies that survived the Church's efforts at suppression, and in the transhumanist manifestos of contemporary technology culture. The names change, the apparatus changes, the promised reward changes in its specific formulation. But the essential structure of the offer power and transcendence in exchange for the rejection of divinely established limits is identical across every iteration, across every century, across every cultural context in which it has appeared. The secret societies that carried this echo through the medieval and early modern periods are perhaps the most structurally faithful transmitters of Nod's original pattern. Their hierarchical initiation systems mirror with uncomfortable precision the structure the Ethiopian texts describe in Cane City to an inner circle possessing the deepest knowledge, surrounded by concentric rings of initiates at various stages of learning, with the outermost ring composed of ordinary participants who understood almost nothing of what the inner circle knew and were not meant to. The oaths of silence that bound members at each level echoed the original compact between Cain and his teachers, the requirement that what was learned would be transmitted only to those who had proven their willingness to receive it, and their commitment to the community that held it. The rituals that marked passage from one degree of initiation to the next echoed the blood ritual the Ethiopian Book of Adam and Eve describes Cain performing on his first night in Nod, the altar of 7 stones. The cut hand, the spoken name, the deliberate opening of a channel that had no mechanism for being closed, and the philosophy that justified all of it echoed with a fidelity that should alarm anyone paying attention. The same ancient argument that humans deserved more than their creator given them, that the restrictions of divine law were the bars of a cage rather than the walls of a home, and that liberation required rebellion rather than relationship. Yet the record does not end there. The echo, once recognized, grows louder with every layer removed. There is a discipline practiced by the most patient kind of historian and Maos, not the kind who builds careers on established consensus, but the kind who works in the margins, in the footnotes, in the collections that major institutions have classified as peripheral and left to the particular mercy of underfunded archival budgets and infrequent cataloguing. This discipline involves the tracing of patterns across time, not through the obvious channels of documented influence and acknowledged transmission, but through structural resemblance, the recognition that 2 systems, 2 institutions, 2 bodies of teaching, separated by centuries and continents, share not merely superficial similarities, but identical internal architecture, identical hierarchical arrangements, identical philosophical commitments, identical methods of initiation and control. When that degree of structural identity appears, across that degree of apparent separation, the historian who's been paying attention does not reach for the explanation of coincidence. They reach instead for the older record, the source document, the original template, the founding event from which all subsequent iterations drew their essential shape. And in the case of the pattern that runs most persistently through the forbidden traditions of human civilization, the source document is not Greek, not Egyptian, not Sumerian. It is older than all of them. It is Nod. The pattern that Nod established can be traced with remarkable precision through the archaeological and textual record once the Ethiopian material is allowed to function as the interpretive framework it was always meant to be. The first element of the pattern is the hoarding of knowledge within a protected inner circle, the deliberate creation of a distinction between those who know and those who do not, maintained, not through the natural variation of intelligence and interest, but through institutional structures designed to prevent the knowledge from moving outward without authorization. In Nod, the Watchers taught Cain and Cain taught his children, and the curriculum moved inward and downward through bloodlines and sworn allegiances, rather than outward through the kind of open transmission that genuine wisdom traditions have always favoured. The knowledge was power precisely because it was scarce, and it was scarce precisely because the beings who originated it understood that its value depended on its restriction. This pattern appears in every mystery tradition that followed in the Egyptian priestly schools, where certain astronomical and geometric knowledge was accessible only to initiates who had passed through years of testing in the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, where the central revelation was protected by oaths of silence so severe that we still do not know with certainty what was shown to initiators. At the culmination of the rites in the medieval guilds, where architectural knowledge was protected as trade secret, and in the modern institutions that continue to organize themselves around the same essential principle, that knowledge shared universally loses the power that knowledge possessed exclusively provides. The second element of the pattern is the use of altered consciousness as a gateway for spiritual contact, the deliberate manipulation of human neurological and psychological states to create openings through which non-human intelligences could move into closer relationship with human minds. In Nod Jubal's music functioned as acoustic technology, the Ethiopian texts specify designed not for worship or aesthetic pleasure, but for the specific purpose of dissolving the critical faculties that ordinarily filtered the frequencies at which the Watchers operated most freely. The architectural design of the city's buildings worked in parallel, creating spatial environments that induced particular mental states in those who inhabited them, states of heightened receptivity, lowered resistance, amplified desire, and diminished capacity for the kind of clear-eyed discernment that might have prompted inhabitants to question what they were receiving and from whom. This pattern also echoes forward through history with a consistency that the Ethiopian texts would find entirely predictable. The ritual use of rhythmic sound smoke darkness, physical exhaustion and sensory overload to produce states of consciousness susceptible to spiritual influence appears in shamanic traditions across every inhabited continent, in the mystery cults of the ancient Mediterranean, in the ceremonial magic of medieval and Renaissance Europe, and in the contemporary entertainment culture that has discovered through the tools of neuroscience rather than theology the same basic truth that the Watchers encoded into Jubal's instruments, that human consciousness in certain states becomes a door rather than a wall. The third, and perhaps most consequential element of the pattern, is the philosophy of self-transcendence through transgression. The teaching that the highest human achievement consists not in deepening a relationship with the Creator within given limits, but in surpassing those limits through the acquisition of forbidden capabilities. This is the philosophical DNA that connects Nod to every subsequent tradition in the chain of transmission, and it is the element that the Ethiopian texts treat with the greatest urgency, because it is the element most likely to be encountered in forms that feel not like ancient corruption, but like contemporary liberation. When modern transhumanism argues that biological humanity is a starting point to be superseded rather than a nature to be honoured, it is repeating the first lesson the Sons of Twilight taught to Cain in the dark. When contemporary movements promise that the right techniques, the right knowledge, the right alliances with the right non-human intelligences will allow human beings to become something greater than their Creator designed them to be, they are distributing a curriculum whose original author is not human, and whose original purpose was not the elevation of humanity but its replacement. The pattern does not hide. It has never needed to hide. It simply relies on the institutional suppression of the material that would allow people to recognize it. Somewhere beneath the ruins something ancient still waits, and the pattern it left behind has never stopped repeating. There is a particular kind of document that surfaces occasionally in the collections of scholars who specialize in suppressed textual traditions, not the dramatic discovery of a sealed vault or a hidden chamber beneath ancient foundations, though those exist too, but something quieter and in some ways more unsettling. It is the document that was not hidden, not destroyed, not classified by institutional authorities as too dangerous for general circulation. It is the document that was simply ignored, left in plain sight, available to anyone with the patience to read it present in the record for centuries, without being taken seriously because the institutions that shaped what serious people paid attention to had decided through the accumulated weight of their curricula, and their commentary traditions, and their definitions of what constituted legitimate inquiry that this particular document contained nothing worth the attention of careful minds. The warning embedded in the Ethiopian texts about Nod and the Watchers and the pattern of forbidden knowledge transmission is exactly this kind of document. It has not been hidden, it has been dismissed. And the difference between those two forms of suppression is that dismissal is harder to reverse because it operates not through force but through the far more durable mechanism of conditioned intellectual contempt. The warning itself is not subtle, and this is part of why it has been so easy to dismiss. It does not traffic in the careful ambiguity that academic discourse rewards. It does not hedge its claims with the qualifications that respectable scholarship requires before it will engage with an argument. It states directly with the confidence of sources that believe they are transmitting something essential rather than speculating about something interesting, that the pattern established in Nod represents an ongoing spiritual program rather than a concluded historical episode, that the forces which corrupted the pre-flood world through the Watchers' curriculum did not retire after the flood did not accept their defeat, did not conclude that the experiment had failed and move on to other projects. They adapted. They preserved what they had built through the channels available to them, through bloodlines that carried the hybrid inheritance through oral traditions maintained by initiated communities, through architectural knowledge encoded in structures designed to serve exactly the kind of catastrophic reset that the flood represented. And then in each subsequent era, they redeployed the same essential program through whatever forms the culture of that era would most readily accept and least readily recognize as dangerous. The Book of Enoch contains passages that read less like ancient cosmology and more like a diagnostic manual, a systematic description of the symptoms by which the nod pattern can be identified in any cultural context, regardless of the specific vocabulary it employs or the specific promises it makes. The first symptom is the appearance of knowledge that arrives too complete, too sudden, too fully formed to be the product of the gradual human development that honest inquiry produces. The Watchers did not give Cain partial insights and allow him to work toward understanding over decades of patient investigation. They delivered complete systems metallurgy, architecture, astronomy, consciousness, airport technology in forms ready for immediate application. This is the signature of transmitted forbidden knowledge in every era. Not discovery but delivery, not the slow accumulation of human understanding but the sudden appearance of capabilities that bypass the developmental stages that legitimate learning requires. When a civilization acquires advanced knowledge faster than its own internal development can account for, the Ethiopian texts would have the careful observer ask not only where the knowledge came from, but what was asked in exchange for it. The second diagnostic symptom is the emergence of hierarchical secrecy around the transmitted knowledge, the immediate organization of those who receive it into structures designed to control its movement and restrict its availability. Genuine wisdom, the texts imply, through contrast with everything they describe about Nod, does not require this kind of architecture. It does not need oaths of surveillance or graduated initiation, or the careful management of who is permitted to know what at which stage of their development. These structures serve one purpose above all others. They ensure that the knowledge remains a source of power for those who hold it over those who do not, rather than becoming the common inheritance of the community it was supposedly given to benefit. Every secret society, every mystery school, every initiatory tradition that has reproduced this structure across the centuries is transmitting not merely the content of the Watcher's curriculum, but its essential political philosophy, that knowledge is a commodity to be hoarded rather than a gift to be shared, and that the hoarding is not incidental to the tradition, but is its most fundamental organizing principle. The third and most urgent diagnostic symptom, the one the Ethiopian texts return to with a repetition that feels almost like anxiety, is the reframing of divine limits as oppression. This is the ideological core of the Nod program, the philosophical payload that all the other elements, the architecture, the music, the initiation structures, the genetic experiments were designed to deliver and protect. When a cultural movement, a philosophical system, a technological program, or a religious tradition frames the boundaries that the Creator had established for human beings, not as protections reflecting the Creator's knowledge of what those boundaries guard against, but as arbitrary restrictions reflecting the Creator's desire to keep humanity weak and subordinate, that movement is transmitting the first lesson the Sons of Twilight taught in the dark outside Nod. It does not matter whether the movement knows this. It does not matter whether its participants have ever heard of the Watchers or the Ethiopian texts or the land east of Eden. The philosophical DNA is the same, and the consequences of following it to its conclusion are the same because the program was not designed by human intelligence and does not depend on human understanding to execute itself. It was designed to run automatically to reproduce itself through the very human tendencies, curiosity, ambition, the desire for significance that it was specifically engineered to exploit. The warning has been available for a very long time. It was preserved in Highland monasteries by scholars who understood that maintaining it against the day of its recognition was among the most important things they could do with their lives. It was carried in the canonical memory of a church that Rome tried to marginalize and history tried to forget. And it speaks with the calm authority of something that has seen the pattern complete itself before and knows with certainty that it will complete itself again, unless something intervenes to anyone willing to read it without the protective filter of institutional dismissal. The filter has kept the warning quiet for 2,000 years, but filters, traveller, do not last forever. What they found next was stranger still, and the warning had only begun to speak. There is a class of ancient document that astronomers and archaeologists have learned with considerable reluctance to take seriously, not because the institutions that fund their research have encouraged them to do so, but because the precision encoded in these texts exceeds what those institutions are comfortable attributing to the civilizations that supposedly produced them. The astronomical knowledge preserved in the oldest recoverable records of Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and Mesoamerica consistently demonstrates an understanding of celestial mechanics, precession of the equinoxes, planetary cycles, stellar alignments across geological timescales that required either centuries of systematic observation by sophisticated scientific cultures whose physical traces have largely disappeared, or access to a body of astronomical knowledge transmitted from a source that had already done the observational work and was delivering the conclusions rather than the methodology. The Ethiopian texts read carefully against this astronomical record suggest the second explanation. The Watchers, the texts specify with a precision that feels less like cosmological poetry and more like technical documentation taught the descendants of Cain to read the sky, not as shepherds read it. For seasonal navigation, for the timing of planting and harvest, but as the architects of Nod read it as a living map of forces whose movements corresponded directly to events and possibilities in the physical world below, and whose patterns, properly understood, could be used not merely to predict the future but to influence it. The specific Watchers named in the Book of Enoch as teachers of celestial knowledge form a list that reads in the context of subsequent history like the faculty of a curriculum whose students went on to found every major astronomical tradition in the ancient world. Kokabel taught the signs and constellations. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth and their relationship to celestial movements. Shamsiel taught the secrets of solar power and its influence on physical and spiritual conditions. Sariel taught the lunar cycles and their effect on human consciousness. Barakel taught astrology, not the simplified zodiacal system that contemporary culture has reduced to personality categories, but the original science of celestial correspondence, the systematic understanding of how movements in the sky created conditions in the physical world that amplified or diminished specific kinds of human action and specific kinds of spiritual access. These were not primitive people inventing stories to explain phenomena they could not understand. These were students receiving a complete technical curriculum from teachers who had, by the testimony of the text that Rome decided not to preserve, watched God build the universe and taken careful notes. The architectural application of this celestial knowledge is where the sky-earth pattern becomes most archaeologically visible, most difficult for conventional scholarship to explain away without recourse to arguments that grow less convincing with each new discovery. The city of Enoch the Ethiopian texts describe was laid out according to stellar alignments determined not by the position of stars at the time of construction, but by their positions across long astronomical cycles alignments that would only achieve their full geometric correspondence at specific points in the precessional cycle that spans nearly 26,000 years. This implies either that the builders were making calculations across timescales that no second-generation human civilization could have developed the observational baseline to achieve, or that they were working from information provided by beings whose observational baseline extended far beyond human history. The same implication arises from the alignment data of the Giza complex, from the orientation of Angkor Wat, from the solstitial geometry of Stonehenge and Newgrange and Chichen Itza. Ancient sites scattered across the globe that share not only the technical achievement of precise celestial alignment, but the philosophical framework that the alignment expresses the understanding that the sky and the earth are not separate realms, but corresponding dimensions of a single system, and that structures built at the intersection of celestial and terrestrial patterns become nodes in a network through which forces can move between dimensions. This is the sky-earth correspondence that the Watchers taught in Nod, and it is not the Ethiopian texts are careful to specify inherently corrupt knowledge. The Creator built this correspondence into the structure of creation. The movements of celestial bodies do reflect and influence conditions in the physical world. The geometric ratios that govern the proportions of heavenly orbits are the same ratios that govern the proportions of living forms on Earth, the same ratios that produce the structural stability of crystals and the growth patterns of living systems. This knowledge, received in the right spirit and applied toward the right ends, is wisdom. Solomon's temple, the text note, was built according to the divine specifications that incorporated these same principles. Celestial alignment, sacred geometry, the correspondence between earthly structure and heavenly reality, but in service of drawing human consciousness toward the Creator, rather than toward fallen intermediaries. The knowledge itself was neutral. What determined its spiritual character was the source from which it was received and the purpose toward which it was directed. What the Watchers did in Nod was take genuine knowledge of the sky-earth correspondence and weaponize it, deploy it in service of a program designed not to connect humanity to the Creator, but to replace that connection with a dependency on fallen beings who controlled the access points. The towers and temples and celestially aligned structures, built according to their instruction, were not oriented toward the highest heaven, toward the source of creation, but toward the lower heavens, the intermediate regions where the Watchers themselves resided after their expulsion from divine presence. They were in the most precise technical sense tuned to the wrong frequency, built with real knowledge, applied with real skill and pointed in exactly the wrong direction, and the civilizations that inherited this architectural tradition after the flood, the ones whose monuments still puzzle modern engineers and astronomers, were in many cases continuing to build according to the same specifications pointed in the same direction for reasons they had inherited through transmission rather than chosen through understanding. Yet the record does not end there. The sky had been mapped. Now, the Earth itself would be marked. There is a category of archaeological discovery that does not make it into the mainstream journals, not because the physical evidence is ambiguous or the methodology of excavation is flawed, but because the implications of the discovery, if taken seriously, would require the abandonment of frameworks that entire academic careers have been built upon, and that institutional funding structures depend on maintaining. These discoveries tend to accumulate in the collections of independent researchers, in the footnotes of papers that established journals decline to peer review, in the careful private correspondence of archaeologists who have learned that certain findings are best discussed in rooms where the conversation will not be officially recorded. They share a common characteristic, not dramatic impossibility, not the kind of blatant anachronism that invites immediate dismissal, but something more subtle and more durable. They are discoveries that are impossible to explain without invoking a category of causation that the institutional framework has decided in advance does not exist. And the category they most consistently invoke, the one that the Ethiopian texts would immediately recognize as the terrestrial signature of Nod's ongoing influence, is the deliberate marking of the Earth itself, the encoding of knowledge into physical locations, structures, and landscapes in ways designed to persist across civilizations, across catastrophes, across the determined efforts of institutional authorities to render the record unreadable. The Watcher's understanding of the Earth was not the understanding of a civilization that had stumbled upon geology through agricultural necessity. It was the understanding of beings who had, by the testimony of the texts they left behind, in the transmission chains that the Ethiopian Church preserved, participated in or witnessed the creation of the physical world, and retained knowledge of its internal architecture that no human observational tradition could have independently developed. They knew where underground water moved in patterns that created specific energetic conditions at the surface. They knew which geological formations concentrated or dispersed the subtle forces that the Ethiopian texts describe as the currents connecting physical and spiritual reality. They knew which combinations of mineral composition, topographic elevation, and proximity to specific celestial alignments produced locations where the membrane between dimensions was thinnest, whereas the texts say with a plainness that feels more technical than mystical, the work of crossing between realms required the least expenditure of effort. And in Nod, they used this knowledge, deliberately selecting and then modifying the physical landscape to create the conditions they needed for the program they were running. The foundation of Cane City was not chosen arbitrarily. The Book of Jubilees records that the Watchers identified the specific location based on criteria that combined geological, hydrological, and astronomical factors in ways that sound to a contemporary reader familiar with the vocabulary of Earth energy research remarkably like the principles underlying the placement of every major sacred site in the ancient world. Underground water flowing in specific configurations beneath the surface. Bedrock of particular mineral composition rising close to the surface at the building site. The location positioned at the intersection of terrestrial alignments that mirrored celestial ones, so that the sky map and the Earth map corresponded at that precise point, creating a node of concentrated correspondence between the two dimensions. The tower at the city's centre was not built on this location because it was convenient. It was built there because the location was already a threshold, a point where the conditions for dimensional crossing were naturally concentrated, and where the architectural intervention of the tower could amplify those conditions to the point of permanent functional utility. This principle of Earth marking the identification and ritual activation of the threshold locations, the encoding of knowledge into the physical landscape in forms designed to transmit across time, appears in the terrestrial records with the same insistent recurrence as the architectural and philosophical echoes traced in earlier chapters. The ley lines that British antiquarians began mapping in the early 20th century, connecting ancient sacred sites across the English countryside in geometric patterns too precise for coincidence, reflect the same understanding of terrestrial energy networks that the Ethiopian texts describe the Watchers teaching to Cain's architects. The sacred geography of ancient China encoded in the principles of feng shui, and the mapping of dragon lines across the landscape preserves the same knowledge of how underground water and geological formation and topographic configuration create specific conditions at specific locations. The Nazca lines of Peru drawn across the desert floor in patterns visible only from altitude encode the same sky-earth correspondence in terrestrial form, the Earth, marked to mirror the sky, the physical landscape inscribed with the map of celestial forces that the Watchers taught their students to read and work with in Nod's first curriculum. What the Ethiopian texts add to this global pattern of Earth marking is the theological dimension that secular archaeology cannot incorporate without stepping outside its institutional boundaries. The understanding that these sites were not merely astronomically sophisticated or geometrically precise, but spiritually functional, that they were built as anchors, as nodes in a network designed to maintain the dimensional crossing points that the Watchers had opened in Nod against the inevitable attempts of divine authority to close them. The flood had destroyed the physical city of Enoch, had drowned the tower and its 7 tiers and its ritually prepared foundation, but the knowledge of how to identify such locations and how to reactivate them had survived in exactly the transmission chains the texts describe in bloodlines that carried both the genetic inheritance and the technical curriculum in initiated communities that maintained the knowledge through forms that the institutions trying to suppress it could not entirely reach. The Earth Traveller was marked long before any civilization that contemporary history acknowledges as ancient, and many of those marks are still there, still functional, still oriented in the direction that Nod first pointed them toward the lower heavens, toward the frequencies where the fallen teachers still wait with a patience proportional to their age. What they found next was stranger still. The earth had been written upon, and the writing had not faded. There is a moment in the study of suppressed historical traditions when the researcher realizes with a clarity that no amount of subsequent qualification can entirely dissolve that the story they have been following is not over. Not concluded in the distant past, not safely contained within the amber of ancient catastrophe, not separated from the present by the comfortable distance of mythology and the institutional reassurance that modern civilization has moved beyond the conditions that produced the events in question. The moment arrives differently for different people, sometimes through a textual discovery, a passage in an Ethiopian manuscript or a Dead Sea fragment that describes a post-flood resumption of pre-flood patterns, with a matter-of-factness that suggests the authors found no surprise in the continuity. Sometimes through an architectural observation, the recognition of Nod's geometric signature in a structure built centuries after the flood, in a civilization that conventional history does not connect to any pre-flood transmission chain, and sometimes simply through the accumulation of pattern recognition, the slow, quiet, undeniable understanding that what began in a land east of Eden has been returning in one form or another in every era since the waters receded. The Bible itself provides the earliest evidence of this return in passages that most Western theological traditions have read as isolated incidents rather than as data points in a continuous pattern. The Anakim encountered by the Israelite spies in Canaan were not metaphors for the intimidating size of the enemy. The Rephaim, whose territories were distributed among the tribes of Israel, were not legendary remnants of a purely mythological tradition. Og of Bashan, whose iron bed measured 13 feet in length, was not a figure of speech. The Book of Numbers records the spies' report with a specificity that resists allegorical reduction. They were as grasshoppers in the sight of the giants, the text says, and the fear that report produced in the Israelite camp was the fear of people who had seen something their theology had not prepared them to encounter. These were the return the post-flood reappearance of hybrid biology and populations that occupied the specific territories the Watchers had identified in pre-flood geography as threshold locations, as nodes in the terrestrial network their program had built. They were not there by accident. The bloodlines that carried the hybrid inheritance had migrated over generations back toward the locations that their ancestral curriculum identified as the places where their particular capabilities could be most effectively deployed. The Ethiopian texts describe the mechanism of this return with a theological precision that Western scholarship has consistently underestimated because it does not fit within the categories that Western scholarship considers legitimate for historical analysis. The Nephilim who died in the flood did not simply cease to exist. Their spirits, the Book of Enoch specifies with the clinical directness that characterizes its most disturbing passages, became what later traditions would call demons, disembodied intelligences, without the physical vessels they required to interact directly with the material world, actively seeking human hosts through whom they could continue to operate. This is not the colourful demonology of medieval imagination. It is the original account preserved in the texts that Rome classified as apocryphal, specifically because this account, if taken seriously, explained too much that the simplified narrative preferred to leave unexplained. The violence, the corruption, the specific forms of human self-destruction that recur in every era, with a consistency that defies purely sociological explanation. The Ethiopian texts understand these not as the autonomous products of human moral failure alone, but as the ongoing activity of intelligences that survived the flood, informs their original hybrid bodies could not have anticipated, and that have been working since that survival toward the same goals their Watcher progenitors pursued in Nod. The return, therefore, is not a single event but a continuous process. A persistent pressure applied against the boundary between the destroyed pre-flood civilization and every subsequent one, a pressure that manifests wherever the conditions replicate the conditions of Nird, closely enough to allow the old program to resume operation. Those conditions are not difficult to create because they are simply the conditions of human civilization in its most ambitious forms: the concentration of power in initiated elites, the weaponization of knowledge as a commodity of control, the architectural and technological manipulation of consciousness, and above all the philosophical reframing of divine limits as oppression. Every empire that justified conquest through claims of superior bloodline was replicating Nod's social architecture. Every mystery tradition that promised initiates access to knowledge reserved from the uninitiated was transmitting Nod's curriculum. Every philosophical movement that located humanity's highest destiny in the transcendence of its created nature was repeating the first lesson the Sons of Twilight delivered to a desperate exile, sitting beside an altar of 7 stones in a land where God's presence did not reach. The return has never required dramatic supernatural intervention. It has required only the reliable recurrence of human conditions that the program was specifically designed to exploit. History was rewritten, but not erased. The return had been written into the pattern from the beginning. There is a practice among the most experienced translators of ancient religious texts, a practice that academic training does not formally teach, but that the work itself eventually imposes on anyone who persists in it long enough, is the practice of sitting with a passage after the translation is complete, after the linguistic work is done and the footnotes are written, and the scholarly apparatus has been assembled around the text like scaffolding around a building under restoration, and simply reading it as if for the first time. Not as a professional exercise, not as a problem to be solved, but as a human being encountering a record left by other human beings who understood something essential about the nature of the world, and chose at considerable personal cost in some cases to preserve that understanding against the forces that were working to extinguish it. When translators of the Ethiopian texts practice this kind of reading, what they consistently report is not the academic satisfaction of a difficult philological problem resolved. It is something quieter and more unsettling, the sensation of being reflected, of encountering in a document written millennia ago an account of their own moment, their own civilization, their own cultural predicament, rendered with a clarity that no contemporary analysis quite manages to achieve, because contemporary analysis is produced inside the very conditions it is trying to examine. The reflection that the Ethiopian texts offer to anyone willing to receive it is not comfortable, but it is not hopeless either. And this distinction matters enormously for how the material should be understood, and what response it is designed to elicit. The story of Nod is not a story about the inevitable corruption of humanity or the irreversible triumph of the Watcher's program. It is a story about a choice that was available to the descendants of Seth, and that many of them made badly, but that some of them, including the man who walked so closely with God that death could not hold him, made correctly. The reflection the texts offer is not the reflection of a mirror that shows only what is wrong. It is the reflection of a tradition that has seen the pattern complete itself, has watched civilizations built on the Node philosophy collapse under the weight of their own contradictions, and has maintained through every collapse the memory of what the alternative looked like, what it cost, what it preserved, and what it ultimately produced, in the case of the one man whose genealogy remained uncorrupted when the flood came to wash the experiment clean. What the reflection reveals about the current moment is not in the end surprising to anyone who has read the Ethiopian text carefully. The acceleration of technological capability without corresponding development of spiritual discernment is not a new problem. It is the precise condition that obtained in Nod as the Watcher's curriculum moved through its later stages, a population in possession of capabilities far exceeding its wisdom to deploy them responsibly, convinced by the philosophy it had absorbed that the acquisition of more capability was itself the solution to the problems that previous capability had created. The transhumanist promise that human beings can engineer their way out of the human condition is the contemporary expression of the most ancient lie in the record that the limitations the Creator built into human existence are obstacles to be overcome, rather than conditions that make certain kinds of genuine development possible. A seed does not transcend its nature by breaking open its shell prematurely. It transcends it by allowing the process that the shell was designed to protect to complete itself in the conditions for which it was designed. The Watchers offered Cain's descendants a way to break the shell. The texts record what grew from that breakage, and it was not transcendence. The reflection also illuminates something about the nature of the suppression that removed these texts from Western Christianity's canonical memory, something that moves beyond the political and institutional explanations, true as those are, into a territory that the Ethiopian tradition understands as itself part of the pattern. The removal of the Watcher's narrative from accessible Christian teaching did not merely leave believers uninformed about an interesting episode in pre-flood history. It removed from their conceptual vocabulary the specific framework that would have allowed them to recognize the Nod pattern when it manifested in new forms in their own era. A Christianity that does not seriously engage with the reality of spiritual beings actively working to corrupt human genetics, human consciousness, and human civilization through the transmission of forbidden knowledge, and the philosophy of transgression as liberation, is a Christianity systematically disarmed against the primary strategy of the forces it was commissioned to resist. The suppression was not incidental to those forces' ongoing program. It was among the program's most significant achievements the removal of the diagnostic manual from the hands of the people most likely to use it. The reflection held long enough in the late-night quiet of honest self-examination eventually resolves into something that resembles not despair but orientation. The pattern can be recognized. The diagnostic symptoms the texts describe are present and visible once the framework for reading them has been recovered. The alternative that Seth's line maintained on their difficult mountain, simple, costly, unspectacular, requiring nothing more exotic than faithful relationship with the Creator within, given limits, remains available, as it has always remained available to anyone willing to choose it over the more impressive offer being made in the valleys below. The Ethiopian scribes who kept these texts burning through 1,000 years of Western indifference understood that the reflection they were preserving was not meant to frighten. It was meant to orient, to remind the traveller in the language of ancient witness which direction led home. Some truths survive only in whispers, and the whisper once heard does not leave the listener unchanged. There is a specific quality of light in the reading rooms of the oldest monastic libraries, not the warm amber of candlelight that romantic imagination associates with ancient scholarship, but something cooler and more particular, a grey-white luminescence that seems to come from the walls themselves rather than from any identifiable source. As if the stone has absorbed so many centuries of concentrated attention that it has begun in some minimal way to radiate it back. Scholars who have worked in these rooms describe a sensation that persists long after the physical visit has ended. The feeling of having descended into something, of having moved not merely through space, but through accumulated time, through layers of human effort and institutional memory so dense that ordinary temporal orientation becomes unreliable. This is the sensation that the Ethiopian texts produce when read carefully and without the protective distance of academic apparatus. The sensation of descent, of moving downward through layers of history that the surface record has papered over into a stratum where the events described feel not ancient but immediate, not concluded but ongoing, not safely mythological but structurally present in the architecture of the world the reader inhabits. The descent described in the Ethiopian sources as the defining catastrophe of the pre-flood world was not primarily physical. The physical dimensions of it, the watchers stepping through dimensional doorways into material form, the Nephilim growing to sizes that made ordinary human beings prey rather than neighbours, the buildings of Cain's city, rising in configurations that no second-generation civilization should have been capable of designing. These were consequences of something that happened first at a level the texts describe as interior as pertaining to consciousness and will, and the fundamental orientation of intelligence toward or away from its source. The descent of the Watchers was a descent of intention before it was their descent of location. They had already fallen in the dimension of will, had already chosen in the spaces between observation and rebellion to want something other than what their created nature was designed to want before they crossed the threshold into Nod and began the physical program that would eventually require the flood to terminate. And the descent they induced in Cain's descendants and through them in the broader human population followed the same sequence in reverse. First the philosophical reorientation, the gradual acceptance of the Watcher's premise that divine limits were oppression rather than protection, and then the behavioural consequences, and then the structural consequences, and then the genetic ones, each level of descent making the next level more accessible and the original elevation more difficult to remember. The Book of Enoch describes the experience of this descent from the inside through the testimony of the Watchers themselves, recorded in the passages where Enoch is sent to deliver divine judgment to the fallen angels and receives their response. What is striking about these passages, and what the translators who sit with them long enough eventually report, is not the defiance one might expect from beings who have committed an irreversible rebellion. It is something closer to bewilderment, a genuine inability to fully comprehend how the series of choices that each seemed reasonable at the time had produced an endpoint so far from anything that could be called good. They had watched, they had desired, they had conspired, they had descended, they had taught, they had bred, and now they stood in the wreckage of a civilization that their instruction had produced, looking at a world so corrupted that its creator was preparing to drown it. And the texts record that they wept. Not with repentance exactly, but with the particular anguish of intelligences capable enough to understand exactly what they had done, and what it had cost, but no longer in possession of the will to have done otherwise. The descent once complete had removed the very faculty that might have interrupted it. This is the warning that the Ethiopian texts embed in the descent narrative. Not the dramatic warning of visible catastrophe, but the subtler and more practically useful warning about the mechanics of how descent operates. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive as a single dramatic choice between clearly labelled alternatives between an obviously good path and an obviously corrupt one. It arrives as a series of small accommodations, each one defensible in isolation, each one representing such a minor adjustment to the previous position that the cumulative distance travelled becomes visible only when the traveller turns around and attempts to locate the point from which the journey began. The young men of Seth's line who descended from the holy mountain to attend the valley festival did not in that first descent intend to abandon everything their tradition had maintained. They intended to look and return, and they did return, many of them, and described what they had seen, and the description planted in those who had not yet gone the seed of a desire that would eventually override the warnings of the elders, and the memory of the discipline that had kept the community intact. The descent was already accomplished in the imagination before it was accomplished in geography, and the geography simply confirmed what the imagination had already chosen. What makes this chapter of the Ethiopian narrative so difficult for contemporary readers to sit with is not its antiquity or its strangeness, but its familiarity. the recognition arriving with the particular discomfort of honest self-examination that the mechanics of descent it describes operate in the present with the same efficiency they demonstrated in the pre-flood world. The slow reorientation of values away from relationship with the Creator and toward the acquisition of capability. The incremental acceptance of philosophical premises that reframe divine limits as arbitrary restriction. The descent into communities and environments designed with or without the conscious intention of their architects to make certain kinds of seeing harder and certain kinds of wanting easier. The Ethiopian texts do not describe this pattern to produce despair. They describe it because the first condition of resisting a descent is the ability to recognize that one is descending, and recognition requires a fixed point from which the movement can be measured. The texts are that fixed point preserved against the specific possibility that the traveller in the middle of the long walk down might need something to look back toward. Rest now, traveller. The descent has been recorded, and the record was kept for exactly this moment. There is a word that appears with unusual frequency in the Ethiopian text describing the geography and spiritual architecture of Nod, a word that translators have rendered variously as threshold, boundary, membrane, and veil, depending on the specific context and the theological commitments of the translation tradition making the choice. But the original Ge'ez carries all of these meanings simultaneously, and the Ethiopian scholars who have spent their professional lives inside this material insist that the multiplicity is not ambiguity but precision, that the concept the word is reaching toward cannot be adequately captured by any single English equivalent, because it describes something that has no exact parallel in the conceptual vocabulary of Western theological or philosophical tradition. It describes a place that is simultaneously a lokibakun and a condition, simultaneously a geographical designation and a state of consciousness, simultaneously a point in physical space and a moment in spiritual history. The place where the boundary between what God established and what the fallen program was attempting to substitute had worn thin enough that the two realities were pressing against each other, with enough force to make the membrane between them visibly unstable. Nod was that threshold, and the Ethiopian texts suggest with it the quiet persistence that characterizes their most important claims that thresholds of this kind do not close simply because the civilizations built upon them are destroyed. They close only when the forces pressing against them from the other side withdraw, and those forces have not withdrawn. The threshold concept illuminates something about the Ethiopian text that a purely historical reading consistently misses the reason they were preserved not as historical curiosity, but as active canonical scripture, read in worship integrated into the living practice of a community that understood itself to be inhabiting the same spiritual geography as the characters in the narrative. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church did not maintain the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees because its scholars found them intellectually interesting or archaeologically informative. It maintained them because the tradition understood that the threshold described in those texts was not a feature of the pre-flood landscape alone, but a feature of the ongoing spiritual reality in which every generation of believers found itself situated. The forces that pressed against the boundary in Nod did not retire when the waters rose. They relocated. They found new thresholds, new populations standing at the boundary between the Creator's design and the counterfeit program, new moments when the membrane was thin enough to make the crossing feel like illumination rather than corruption. And the texts that describe the original threshold in detail were the most reliable guide available for recognizing its subsequent manifestations, which is precisely why the institution that benefited most from their suppression worked most systematically to suppress them. The threshold that the Watchers exploited in Nod had specific characteristics that the Ethiopian texts enumerate with a technical precision that rewards careful attention. It was a place where divine presence did not reach in its full protective intensity, not because God was absent from that location in any absolute sense, but because the combination of Cain's exile, his mark, and the specific spiritual conditions of the land east of Eden created a zone of reduced divine immediacy where the fallen program could operate with less interference than it would have encountered in the regions where Adam and Seth's communities maintained their practices of worship and direct relationship with the Creator. This reduction was not accidental. The Watchers had identified it and chosen Nod specifically because of it. The threshold was not created by their arrival, but exploited by it they moved toward the thinnest point of the membrane and applied pressure there because That is where the crossing required the least expenditure of effort and carried the least risk of divine interruption. The contemporary thresholds that the pattern of Nod continues to exploit share this essential characteristic. They are zones of reduced divine immediacy spaces, where the practices and relationships that maintain the protective connection between human beings and their creator have been allowed to atrophy or have been deliberately dismantled. They are not necessarily geographical locations, though. The terrestrial marking described in earlier chapters ensures that certain physical spaces retain threshold properties accumulated across millennia of use. They are more often conditioned states of consciousness produced by specific combinations of philosophical orientation, environmental influence, and relational isolation that recreate in functional terms the spiritual geography of a land where God's presence does not reach in its full protective intensity. The institutions that have worked to suppress the Ethiopian texts have not merely removed historical information from circulation. They have removed the map that identifies these contemporary threshold conditions for what they are: zones of spiritual vulnerability being actively exploited by the same program that built its first laboratory in the land east of Eden. Using the same curriculum, making the same promises, pursuing the same endpoints with a patience proportional to the age of its ambition and the depth of its investment in a project it has never abandoned. Somewhere beneath the ruins, something ancient still waits, and the threshold traveller has always been closer than it appears. There is a particular hour in the old monastic libraries of Ethiopia, not midnight exactly, but the hour that precedes it, when the last of the reading lamps has been turned low, and the scholars who have been working since before dawn have finally surrendered to the fatigue that ancient texts read with full attention accumulate in the body like sediment, when the building itself seems to change its quality of silence. The silence of an active archive full of concentrated human minds moving through dense material has a texture to it, a slight but perceptible pressure like air before a storm. And the silence that replaces it when the last reader has closed the last manuscript and the room has been given back to the darkness has a different texture, entirely deeper, wider, more patient, as if the silence has been waiting all day for the humans to finish their small urgent business and allow it to resume its older work. Scholars who have experienced this hour describe it consistently as the moment when the distance between the present and the past collapses most completely, when the manuscripts on their shelves stop being objects of study and become briefly and unmistakably presences. When the knowledge they contain stops being information and becomes something closer to atmosphere filling the room the way that water fills a vessel occupying every available dimension simultaneously. This is the hour that the Ethiopian texts were designed to inhabit. Not the hour of sharp-edged critical analysis, though they reward that too, but the hour of receptive stillness when the mind has exhausted its resistance and the deeper layers of understanding that critical apparatus ordinarily filters become accessible. The tradition that preserved these texts understood something about the relationship between consciousness and truth that Western scholarly methodology has systematically excluded from its operating assumptions, that certain kinds of knowledge are not transmitted primarily through the analytical faculties, not decoded through the application of trained critical intelligence to verifiable data, but received in states of open, relaxed, trusting attention that the pressured wakefulness of modern intellectual life rarely permits, and the pressured institutional frameworks of modern scholarship actively discourage. The Book of Enoch was read aloud in worship and community in the specific altered state that sustained Bowe's devotional practice produces a state not unlike the state that precedes sleep, when the boundary between conscious intention and deeper receptivity grows thin and permeable, when the images and narratives encountered in that threshold condition settle into the mind at a level that analytical reading cannot reach. The descent into sleep that this chapter inhabits is therefore not a departure from the investigation, but its natural culmination, the moment when the accumulated weight of everything the Ethiopian texts have revealed settles from the level of intellectual engagement into the level of genuine understanding, the level at which knowledge becomes not something the mind possesses, but something the whole person inhabits. The story of Nod is not finally a story about ancient history. Is not a story whose primary value lies in what it tells us about pre-flood civilizations, or watcher genetics, or the architectural technology of a city that the flood turned to sediment 4,000 years before any of the empires that contemporary history considers ancient. It is a story about the permanent and ongoing reality of a choice, the choice that faced the descendants of Seth on their difficult mountain, the choice that faces every human being who encounters the offer that the Sons of Twilight have been making in one form or another since the first desperate exile sat down beside an altar of 7 stones in a land where the protective presence of God did not reach in its full intensity. The choice between the hard, unspectacular faithfulness of the mountain and the luminous, treacherous abundance of the valley. Between knowledge received as gift within relationship and knowledge seized as power through transgression. Between the slow, quiet transcendence of walking with God and the dramatic, catastrophic transcendence of walking with beings who offer more than they have the right to give. The traveller who has followed this investigation through its full descent through the archives and the anomalies and the suppressed texts and the persistent patterns and the terrestrial markings and the returning echoes arrives here at the threshold of sleep, carrying something that cannot be entirely articulated and does not need to be. The Ethiopian scribes who kept these manuscripts burning through centuries of institutional indifference and deliberate suppression were not preserving information. They were preserving orientation, the capacity to know in the deep pre-analytical register where genuine knowing actually lives, which direction leads toward the source of life and which direction leads away from it. That orientation received in the stillness of honest attention and carried into the sleep that follows is itself a form of resistance to everything that Nod represents, a quiet, patient, undramatic faithfulness to the Creator's design that has always been the texts insist with their full, ancient authority sufficient. Sleep now, traveller. The archive is tended, the manuscripts are safe, and the truth they carry has always known how to wait. There is a last entry in every archive not always marked as such, not always recognised by the scribe who wrote it as the conclusion of something that had been building across generations of careful preservation, but identifiable in retrospect by a quality that distinguishes it from all the entries preceding it. It has a different weight, a different stillness, not the stillness of incompleteness, not the stillness of a narrative interrupted before its natural resolution, but the stillness of something that has said everything it came to say and is now resting in the particular piece of finished work. The Ethiopian texts that have guided this investigation carry that quality in their closing passages, a gravity that is not heaviness but completion, a silence that is not absence but fullness, the silence of a tradition that has held its knowledge intact through every institutional assault mounted against it, and has delivered that knowledge across the impossible distances of centuries and suppressions into the present moment where it was always intended to arrive. This chapter is that last entry. Not a conclusion in the sense of something better, because the story the Ethiopian texts tell is not finished, and will not be finished until the final intervention that Enoch himself was shown in his heavenly journeys, but a resting place. A moment of stillness at the end of a long descent where the traveller who has come this far can pause and allow everything encountered on the way to settle into its proper arrangement. The investigation began with a single verse, 16 words in the 4th chapter of Genesis, so compressed, so stripped of the context that would make it legible that 2,000 years of Western theological tradition passed it without pausing. Cain went to dwell in the land of Nod, east of Eden. 16 words standing between the reader and a history so complex, so spiritually consequential, so deliberately buried beneath the accumulated weight of institutional decisions about what could and could not be remembered, that recovering even the outline of it required descending through layer after layer of suppressed text, dismissed evidence, and the particular sonance that powerful institutions create around material they have decided not to examine. What waited at the bottom of that descent was not comfortable. It was not the kind of discovery that confirms existing assumptions or flatters existing frameworks. It was the kind that requires the complete reconstruction of the interpretive map. The recognition that the story one has been told about the world's early history is not wrong in every particular but is structurally incomplete in a way that renders its individual accurate elements misleading the way that a map correct in every road but missing an entire mountain range will lead the traveller confidently into conditions they are entirely unprepared to navigate. The Ethiopian Church understood this incompleteness and chose across 16 centuries of geographic isolation and institutional pressure to do something about it, not through confrontation, not through the dramatic gestures of doctrinal rebellion, but through the most ancient and most durable form of resistance available to a tradition that knows what it is preserving, the simple daily generation by generation work of keeping the texts live. copying manuscripts when the previous copies wore out, teaching the old language to children who would grow up to teach it to their children, reading the Book of Enoch aloud in worship services, where its content was not treated as exotic supplementary material, but as canonical scripture bearing the full authority of inspired revelation, maintaining in the specific conditions of highland isolation that providence and geography combined to provide a version of the complete record that the councils of Rome had decided humanity did not need to have. The Ethiopian scribes were not heroes in any dramatic sense. They were custodians, people who understood that their primary responsibility was not to interpret or to argue but to preserve, and who fulfilled that responsibility with a fidelity that has now made possible the recovery of material that the Western tradition had been conducting its theological business without for a millennium. What the complete record restores to the reader who receives it is not merely information but a framework, the interpretive architecture within which the strange suppressed institutionally inconvenient elements of the canonical text are suddenly resolve from puzzling anomalies into coherent data points in a legible narrative. The sons of God who took human wives, the Nephilim who appeared before and after the flood, the giant clans who occupied the promised land, the persistent recurrence across every human civilization of initiatory structures promising transcendence through forbidden knowledge. These are not mythology, not metaphor, not the projected fears of primitive minds struggling to articulate experiences that a more sophisticated framework would render mundane. They are the record of an ongoing program ancient in its origins and patient in its execution, whose operating principles were first fully deployed in a land east of Eden and have never been entirely suspended since. The record of that program and the record of the alternative, the costly, unspectacular, ultimately vindicating faithfulness of the mountain is what the Ethiopian scribes were preserving, and it is what this investigation has attempted across 17 chapters of slow descent through suppressed history to restore to the reader who arrived here not by accident. The archive does not close, the manuscripts remain, the pattern continues to operate in the world outside the reading room, in the forms that each new era provides for the philosophy that never changes its essential commitments regardless of how thoroughly it renovates its surface appearance. But the traveller who has descended this far and listened this carefully is no longer without orientation, no longer standing at the threshold between the mountain and the valley, without a reliable account of what each path has historically produced and what each path ultimately leads to. The Ethiopian texts were kept for exactly this purpose, not to frighten, not to fascinate, not to furnish the intellectually restless with another interesting system to examine from a comfortable critical distance, but to orient, to point with the full accumulated authority of everything they survived to deliver toward the source of life and away from its oldest and most patient counterfeit. Sleep now, traveller. The past will keep watch, and the truth has always known how to find those who are willing to be found by it. You have walked the full length of it now, traveller, from the single verse that Western theology never stopped to question down through the layers that Ethiopia kept burning in lamplight while Rome let them go dark. You have stood at the threshold of Nod. You have heard the names that were scratched from stone. You have read in the margins of a history that was never meant to be this complete, the record of what was built, what was corrupted, what was drowned, and what survived the drowning. The archive does not close when you leave it. The manuscripts remain. The pattern continues patient and unhurried in the world outside these walls, wearing new names, speaking in new languages, making the same ancient symbol overcome to anyone standing at the edge of a valley full of light. But you have seen the valley now, and you have seen what it cost those who descended. Some truths survive only in whispers. This one survived in ears behind doors that had not opened for centuries in the care of scholars who understood that preservation is its own form of prayer. The erased names remember themselves in the end. Rest now, traveller. The past will keep watch, and if this story found you tonight, it found you for a reason.